Today's episode is brought to you by Torero. Stop worrying if your peers have the environment to run your automation. Torero is a free tool that enables you to launch Python, playbooks, and plans against production while handling dependencies. Find out more at torero.dev. Torero.dev.
Packet pushers.
Hello and welcome to the Network Automation Nerds podcast, where we explore the latest in network automation from a practitioner's perspective. I'm your host, Eric Cho, a network engineer who loves everything about network automation. I am hosting this episode with a bit of a heavy heart and mixed feelings. Our guest today has spent many years shaping, inspiring, and leading the network engineering industry. He's the motivation of me to start my podcast and even go beyond then was the reason I started listening to podcasts, because I found people discussing the issues that I care about. The topics were interesting and obviously was very entertaining. And we've all heard about the breaking news, the insightful industry analysts, of course, the humor of Greg Ferro that he keeps us all engaging and while listening. And he's the guest for today's episode. I am honored to have Greg with us today. Welcome to the show, Greg. Tell us, how does it feel as you prepare to turn the page for the next chapter of your life, really?
Overwhelming, I think. I mean, how many times do you retire? There's a backstory, and we'll get into it in a minute. But I think the thing is that since I announced my retirement, I think 3 weeks ago or so, as we record this, I'm T-1.
Yeah.
Tomorrow is my last day with Packet Pushers, and I will be going completely dark. So offline, no social media, no emails. Everything I have online will be shut down as I go off to look after myself, basically.
Right.
So I think for me, probably the responses of people who've left comments on LinkedIn and so many positive, wonderful stories. And people have been in the DMs and in the Slack channels and so forth, also said some amazing things. And I think the thing that I said once was, me no cry because cookie finished, me happy because cookie happened.
Yes.
That's the Cookie Monster from Sesame Street. But it's a lovely story because it's like, can you be sad about leaving or can you be happy because it happened? And I think I'm going to make the choice to be happy that it happened. And while I'm not going because I want to, I'm going because I have to. It's not entirely my choice. I mean, obviously I'm making the choices, but I have some medical problems that I've been struggling with for most of my life. But just recently, those medical, I have chronic fatigue or, whatever you want to call it. And I have had for 35, 40 years going on. And just lately, it's defeating me. Now, is that because the job's too hard? I mean, being a co-founder at Packet Pushers and running a business and finding sales and producing content and talking to people and reaching out to people. And, it's just constant. Like you're always online. It just got to the point where really I have to take a break. I really have to stop. And so now that's where we're at. I mean, I'm 58. So people say, are you retiring? And the answer is yes, but maybe not. At the moment, I'm retiring because I need to, and I'm going to go off and do that. Could I come back? I think a lot of people who retire from business do come back. I spoke to somebody the other day, actually, and I was chatting to them, and they said, oh, yes. He said, yes, when I retired, he said it was horrible and I hated it. So I went and got another job somewhere else. He said, I changed jobs completely. 6 months after going back to work, I think he retired for a year, and he just decided that going back to work would be the right thing to do.
Right.
So he went back to work and he hated it. He said 6 months in, he hated it. So he quit again for good.
Yeah.
I mean, could that happen? It could,
Yeah, I do want to make it clear. This is a celebration of what you have achieved, right? And you mentioned in the exit interview with Greg, you should tell the quote. Was it Winnie the Pooh?
Yes, here it is. How lucky I am to have something that makes saying goodbye so hard. Winnie the Pooh.
Oh my God, it's beautiful.
It's a beautiful, beautiful. When I read that, I was like, oh yeah. So, Packet Pushers started in 2010. But I was blogging back in 2006. And my first attempt at blogging didn't work because in those days, you had to get your own software up and running.
Like your own WordPress and all that. Even go back to hosting your own machines and static IP and all of that.
Yeah, you actually had to hire a machine. You have to rent a machine, and then you had to put the software on. And the first blogging software I got didn't work out at all. It was horrible. And it drove me away from blogging because I was spending all this time futzing around with the blogging software. Valuable lesson to learn. Don't futz with the software. If the software is no good, just throw it away and get something else. Like if it's that bad, don't get stuck with the sunk cost fallacy. So I decided to throw it away. And then in 2007, I started working on WordPress. And then in January 2008, I started blogging. I was at a job. For the last 10 years, I'd been working freelance for 10 years at that point, right?
Which is amazing, actually.
Well, it was just what it was. It's a long, complicated story, but nobody wants to hear that. The thing about being a freelancer or a contractor is you come in for 6 weeks or 6 months or a year or whatever the period is, but you'll never be part of the team. That for some reason you're always on the outside, right? Now,
Hmm.
and every company's a bit different. Some of them are more in, and some of them are just outright hostile to the outsider, and whatever. It meant I was never going to be able to mentor anybody or to help people or to train someone. So the blog was my way of giving something back, and I had plenty of time. I was working on a project, and the project had gone onto a hiatus, and I had loads of time during the day. So I would spend the day sitting at my desk writing,
Hmm.
looking very, very busy.
Earning your
Right.
contractor hour with community contribution.
That's right. Yeah, earning on my hourly rate.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Then as the jobs went on, I started to travel for jobs. I had one job I traveled an hour and a quarter in the morning and an hour and a quarter back home on the train in the evening. So I would write a blog post on the way in. I'd do the final rewrite on the way home and then publish it in the evening when I got home. This is before mobile phones and broadband mobile internet and all that. It was all on a laptop in Mars Edit. Mars Edit on the MacBook was my writing. I would write all in that. I'd do diagrams and all that sort of stuff. And that just took off. Like within a year, I went from, oh, I'm having a good time. It's nothing. Within 6 months, I was being contacted by vendors to come and attend their conferences all over the world and being flown. So, like influencers today,
Hmm.
and they get sent free stuff and they get invited to events and things like that. That's what we were doing back in 2009.
You're the OG of influencers, right?
Yeah. And because I was on this job and I would go to them and say, like, can I take a week off? I've got to go away. And they go, sure, sure, you're the contractor. So long as you take a week off, that's a week we don't have to pay you, right?
Right,
So it
right.
wasn't too hard to go. And it was kind of fun, like get on a plane, go somewhere like, Cisco Live or HB Discover or Dell World or whatever. And because we were bloggers, PR people would take us out to dinner and we got to interview with the senior executives and then I'd go back. So now you can imagine this back in 2010. Imagine coming back to work and people would be talking to you. And like, I've never ever talked about it. What I did, I just said, I'm going away and I'll be back. And then I'm sitting at meetings and these people would say things like, I've heard about this new product. I wonder if we can, because they would have this local reseller who'd then talk to the local vendor.
Right.
And I'd say, oh, yeah, I'll ask somebody, right?
Yeah.
I'd email the senior vice president of big brand name company up here
Yeah.
and say, I've heard about this and the company, and they go, like, oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. And they'd send me out, give them all the information. They go like, how do you do this? I'm going, oh, well, I've got contacts.
A few pay grades on top of the VARs that they were contacting.
That's right. Well, I wasn't just going through the VARs. I was actually going through the local product managers, the local sales teams, and
Exactly.
going to the global product manager. I wasn't even dealing with the European, of course. And suddenly you start looking like the smartest person in the room.
Hmm. That was back then when there was like walls for information flowing, right? Like much more so than today. So you kind of broke those walls for whoever was hiring you.
It had an interesting impact on my career because I would, be over at these events and I'd be sitting in the sessions at Discover or Cisco Live or Dell Tech World or Juniper's conference or whatever, and I would meet people and they would talk to me about their products. So my writing moved away from something that was very tech specific, like BGP, or I did a lot of work on blue coat proxies for a while.
Hmm.
I did a lot of work with SSL interception. I was doing a lot of cybersecurity work, deploying appliances. So I was working with TLS interception, outbound proxies, inbound proxies, application inspection firewalls, redundant clusters with $5 million worth of cybersecurity gear, and you have to make it work.
Hmm.
And there was just one person, me, making it all go because nobody else wanted to work on the cybersecurity stuff.
Yeah.
Everybody else wanted to work on the Cisco stuff or the Juniper stuff. And I just thought that was boring because I passed
Hmm.
my CCIE 10 years ago, and the Cisco stuff really wasn't very interesting to me at that time because it was like, oh, yeah, whatever. I can do that anytime. And it's all just bug hunting anyway. At that time, most of the vendors, it wasn't what you knew, it's which bugs you knew.
Mm.
Right? The products were so immature and so often had so many bugs or gotchas or catches and things like that, is that you spent most of your time looking for bugs or gotchas and
Hmm.
digging your way out of it. And that was very unsatisfying at that time frame. So I was really happy to go off and do.
Yeah,
Yeah.
how many tag cases have you opened? And then you get down to the bottom of it. So the tag engine, like you push hard enough, the tag engineer would go to the
Mm,
developer, and the developer would
mm,
go, "Oh yeah, there's this back door, or there's this like
yeah.
deep shell that you go into to get
Yeah.
grab the answer." And you accumulate enough of that, then you're excelling and getting ahead of your peers.
But it wasn't interesting work, right?
Yeah,
My
yeah.
ability to track a bug as a customer, you don't learn from it. It's
Hmm.
just demoralizing and horrible work. Because it's like driving around in a 20-year-old car and having a boot full of tools, and every time you want to go somewhere you've got to fix something before you can go, right? And
Yeah.
it really was unsatisfying and unhappy work. So I was more than happy to go off and work on anything but routers and switches, right?
Hmm.
Because it just was tedious and dull, and I didn't find any stimulation in it. So I started writing about all of that, and then all of a sudden, my blog became like, oh, I was talking to this vendor about this product, and I would post some thoughts about, you know, here's some thoughts on that. And so I shifted from a practitioner's focus, for a practitioner or an operational focus, to more of a design and strategy focus.
Hmm.
And that led into an analytic focus. So
Hmm.
these days I have moved from that 2010 era, 2009, 2010 era, I've moved from being operational practitioner, operational type thing, up to an analyst level. So now most vendors would have seen me as an analyst. And quite often I am treated at the same level as a Gartner analyst or an IDC analyst or a Forrester analyst, because the influence that Packet Pushers has been able to build as a team is more far reaching than those, because we influence a larger audience, because we're available to everybody. So one of the interesting things that I found out is that all of the other analysts from the big analyst firms listen to us, or track what we're saying,
Yeah.
because sometimes they'll take those ideas, and they won't take them all the time, right? Some of my ideas are really crazy, and I'll come up with a particular perspective on things. But it is true that they are listening to what we say and then saying like, no, I don't know if I like that, or maybe there's something there. So it's an interesting one. Sometimes you'll hear it on Packet Pushers, and then 6 to 12 weeks later it'll appear in an analyst report. Is that because they heard it from us, or is that just because it was obvious and anybody would work it out? Who knows? I don't know. And I
They
never
were
really worried about it.
they
So
were wondering why you're giving it for free. I like, this is great content and Greg is giving it
yeah.
for free. And then they cross out the things that I wouldn't say crazy. I would say they're like not sponsor safe. So they'll be like, okay, maybe I should just reward that a little bit to have a little more padding so that it doesn't, hurt people's egos or whatnot. But I would agree. I think your content, especially for network breaks, I mean, you summarize
Mm,
everything. So you really bring out the convenient factor for people. They don't need to spend an hour listen to the product briefing. They could just listen to you, your conclusion, and then you kind of reverse engineer, especially for the certification track, right? You're taking the book's
mm.
textbook answer and then how well you remember that. But yeah, sorry, I
Yeah,
cut you off.
right. But if I say, there's a new product announced this week, we could talk about the product, and there are times when talking about the product is the right thing to do.
Hmm.
But maybe the background here is that the vendor is, not in touch with the market and struggling to, to keep up. And is this product then a reaction to what another vendor's done, or is it leading the market? And
Right.
if it's leading the market, what does that mean? Right. So if take, for example, Palo Alto and Fortinet, two companies, security companies, who now have, I think Fortinet is about 40 to $50 billion worth of market value, and Palo Alto is 70 to 80 billion. Their security business is 4 or 5 times larger than Cisco's security business.
Hmm.
So how did they grow so much bigger than Cisco's security business when Cisco was the incumbent? Like they're fine. And the answer there is, of course, that Cisco's products haven't innovated in a long period of time. They're still running the same firewalls from a company they bought nearly 15 years ago. They haven't done the fundamentals to revamp the product, to refresh it, to tear it down and rebuild. Like everybody else has gone off and rewritten their operating system and changed their silicon. But until you go away and do the research and then you think about it, and then you notice, but the first thing you have to see is like, okay, well, if Fortinet's got a $40 billion valuation at 40 to 50, and Cisco's got a 250 billion valuation, how much of that is security? And the answer is not 50 billion, much,
Hmm.
much smaller, because it's got all the other stuff going on, right? And
Right.
Palo Alto. So you can then conclude from there, if you're drawing that logic out, that Cisco's no longer an innovator. It is just staying with the same products, keeping them going, but it's not innovating, right? You can make all of that just from looking at a product launch.
How do you do that? So I'm interested in, so as many of you know, I run my own tech media stuff as a company, my own LLC. So I'm kind of looking at my own P&L and income statement, balance sheet, that sort of stuff. So I'm interested in the business aspect of a lot of what you're talking about. But I'm
Mm.
wondering, do you have a framework going from just the product into the backstories, and what do you do first? What would you recommend doing first? Do you follow the money? Do you just kind of read
Yeah,
into it,
all of
the
that.
press release?
All of that, right? So yeah, certainly the money is one thing, but the other thing is to understand how the vendors work internally. And that is the thing that I learned from blogging and then meeting the vendors and talking to them. and realizing that, those are big companies and they have big company problems. You've worked inside of a big company, right?
Hmm.
They're dysfunctional, they're dumb, they're stupid. There's one division going this way, there's one division going in the opposite direction. There's another division pulling upwards, there's another division going forwards. And which way do you end up going?
Hmm.
Well, somewhere, but maybe not what any one of those four different divisions, like they just sort of stumble along and then suddenly, we get to a destination and we all go, that's exactly where we were going. You knew that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you're right. So I think a lot of companies where when people are looking outside in, they think they're this one coherent, uniform company. But let's just use, I mean, nothing
Yeah.
against Microsoft, right? But that I'm only mentioning Microsoft because that's the most recent, I guess, Fortune 10
Mm,
company that I've been in. So people think of Microsoft as
mm,
one company, but no, they're not. They're Windows, they're Azure, they're Xbox, they're Office
yeah.
365, they're all these other stuff. And then the smaller like VS Code and all these other, smaller components.
Here's how I learned about that. I was talking to somebody from a
Hmm.
big company and he said, no, no, you're not getting it right. You need to understand that a big company is not a super tanker and everybody's on board and going in the same direction. It's 1,000 rowboats. It's not a super tanker, it's 1,000
Hmm.
rowboats. And if you're lucky, most of them are going in the same
Right.
direction. But that doesn't mean that there's not rowboats pulling in the other direction or going sideways or getting tangled up in the other. And that was actually a very powerful thought when you started thinking about it, because that started to open my eyes into the fact that, one of the things is that when you first started in your career, from in my era, was that the big companies always had all the information. They were all powerful and they sort of deigned to talk to some of us, sort of thing. And what I came to realize is that they're just dysfunctional with the same people. Just because you work for a vendor today doesn't mean you're not working for a customer. They're all made of the same
Hmm.
thing. People like me work for a vendor and they're no smarter or dumber
Hmm.
than me, and they don't get superpowers just because they're inside a big company. They get access to resources. Of course, they've got, if you've got access to resources, you can be the smartest person in the
Yeah.
room,
Yeah.
right? If you can go and talk to the person who designed the ASIC and ask questions about it, you're going to be smarter than a customer who's got no access to that
Right.
information. So there's no reason to worship any of those people. Now, let's be clear. There are some people inside of those organizations who do have an outsized impact. But those are few people. Generally, it's 1,000
Yeah.
rowboats.
I mean, back to your point about I wish I had listened to that and believed that, right? Like it's one thing that you listen to say they're no different than you.
Mm,
It's another that you believed in it. I mean, I remember when because we moved to the Seattle region for my wife to take a job with Microsoft. So I wasn't with Microsoft back then, but I
mhm,
remember just coming in from a non-technical degree background. Everything I learned about networking was self-taught and reading books and go through a certification route.
mm,
So I remember going into that building and just feel very intimidated and feel like, hey, I'm in the wrong place. I am like that imposter
yeah.
syndrome was 5,000 pounds of weight just on my back. I feel so inferior. But,
Mhm.
like you said, they're no different than you. And they just have spent more time on it. So one thing that
They've just got access to resources that you
or
don't
just spend
have,
more time on it and yeah,
right?
with those resources and then they they
Yeah.
they kind of spend more study more and thought about it more and gave it some deep thoughts. So I totally
Yeah.
agree with that.
Yeah. And it's so don't, you know, and I mean the vendor's main op and the thing to realize from a business perspective, the vendor's goal is to rip off your employer, and your goal is to prevent them from ripping off your employer, right? Right? They're there to charge. Well, no, I mean, you look at it, right? Their goal is to make as much profit for their employer so that their shareholders make
Right.
money. And in theory, some of that will trickle down to the employees. It rarely does, but that's a different story, right? But you're a representative of an employer, and your job is to spend the least amount of money and play the other side of that game, to spend the least amount of money to get the maximum results for not doing any,
Yeah.
right? And yet, right? And you could work for a company who's got, people drive around in 10-year-old secondhand cars, but you go into their data center and it's full of all these brand new brand name servers that have that do not match the actual financials of the company. The company cannot afford to own this equipment because somewhere in the IT it's this, oh, we have to buy branded products because.
Right.
because that's what everybody does, right?
Hmm.
And the answer is, well, if your car park outside is full of Range Rovers and Jaguars and, Rolls Royces, absolutely, your company's got the money. But in absence of that, if you're a normal company that's stumbling along and barely, like most mid-sized businesses are right on the edge of, you know, they're not necessarily making a whole bunch of profits. You should not be buying brand name servers, right? Those companies can tolerate an outage. Those companies can, they don't need, redundant Rolls Royces to get the CEO to work.
Hmm.
All they need is a car that's going to get them to work 215 days out of 220. And if you don't show up for a couple of days, the world won't end. Not a big deal, right?
Yeah.
And there's just so much massive waste that goes on in enterprise IT because of that. It does bother me a lot that people don't match that. You know what I'm saying?
I totally agree because I mean I won't name which vendor it was, but I do know
Mm,
some vendors spend extra dollar on the cosmetics of the outside, the color, and people do buy things just because of that color, even though nobody looks at it. It's
mm.
in the dark corner of the data center somewhere, but they want to see blinking lights, they want to see matching,
Yeah,
color of that.
yeah,
So it goes into what you were talking about, maybe at the extreme case of yeah,
mm,
why do I even buy? I won't even say what color because you might give it away. But it's
yeah.
like, yeah, why do I need to buy this color?
There were companies back in the day when they used to do a bright yellow box, and they did the bright yellow so that when people walked around the data center, they go, "That's a that vendor."
Yeah, they have like a good warm, fuzzy feeling of it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. But I mean, like that's the goal, and the vendor's goal is to sell you the most amount of product at the maximum profit margin, and your goal is to buy the least amount of product at the lowest possible cost. But nobody ever does. How many people have bought Oracle or SAP when all they needed was Quicken?
Like a spreadsheet. Yeah. Light SQL.
Or a simple, buy a team of developers for a couple of weeks to write you a simple database with a front end, but no, they've all ended up buying SAP or something and, spending tens of millions pointlessly on a game they don't need. And that does bother me. And that's one of the things about public cloud is that it has woken people up to some part of that, to the actual underlying cost.
Right.
So we now know that public cloud is roughly 3 times as expensive as on-prem. But it is also saying when we were doing on-prem and we were just buying stuff once every 5 to 10 years, nobody was really looking at the price of things. They were just going like, "Oh, we're buying this for 5 to 10 years. It's the price, right?"
Hmm.
And then overbuying because the server was going to last 5 years. Well, now you buy the server and it should last 2 years max before you're throwing it out,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
You should only buy exactly what you need because in 2 years, you're going to buy it again. So you should not buy it with extra sockets or memory expansions. This is where Apple has a very good lesson to learn.
Hmm.
Apple does not allow you to expand the memory. Apple does not allow you to switch the CPUs or the screens. And the answer there is that machine will happily last you 5 to 7 years. And when it doesn't, go and buy another one because the difference between what you bought over that time period will be so much more performant, 400, 500 times more, that it doesn't make sense to add more memory or that it doesn't make sense, especially in professional categories. Don't think about this from your personal money, but I'm using Apple as an example. If you're buying their laptops, or their desktops or whatever, that is the thinking behind this because the technology will move so fast in the time frame that it no longer makes sense to upgrade or expand.
I was one of those unhappy people when Apple did that, but I do have to agree with you that especially, that's the whole direction that they're moving toward,
Mm,
everything soldered onto the logic board and all of that. And what I would
mm,
also say is Apple have really invested because of the direction that they're going. Apple have
mm.
invested enormous amount of resources in making that upgrade experience better, whether that's for your
Yeah.
iPhone, whether that's for your Mac, whether that's, all these other stuff that the ecosystem. So, I think reading into it is the most critical lesson that you're telling us here is don't just take the word for it, don't just read the press release, but go into thinking about their strategy.
I mean, like the example I often give is like when you buy a car at 19, do you expect to upgrade it for when you're 25? Do
Mm,
you expect to expand it so it goes from a two-seater to a four-seater? And then when you're 30 odd and you're married and you have your first 2 kids, do you then expand it into a sedan?
yeah, or minivan.
Or a minivan, right? And with baby seats in the back, blah, blah, blah. No, you go and buy another one.
Yeah.
But this idea that computers should be expandable and flexible. Now, I do have concerns about recycling and reuse. Yes, you're quite right. But the point is that the technologies are still advancing in that. So 3 years after you bought your phone, the new phones are not twice as good. They're 3 times as good or more. right?
Mhm.
The cameras are so much better and so forth. So if you are somebody who actually wants the new features, that's an if. You don't have to. I've got a 5-year-old iPhone, works fine, and then the battery's good, and I don't need to replace the battery, etc., etc. But you get my point, right?
Yeah.
So I think people need to say, like, when I buy my on-prem infrastructure, just buy what you need. Don't say, I've only got one chance to buy this in the next 10 years, and then buy quad core multi-terabit server chassis and then say, well, we can buy the upgrades for them. And you know the dirty little secret here?
Yeah.
By the time you come to buy those upgrades, they're obsolete and you can't get them,
The SKU
right?
is already out of date.
The SKUs are already out of date. They're not manufactured. Or the other one is because the vendors have had to hold them in stock, they're so expensive as to be impractical to buy. Right?
Yeah.
Because the vendors had to buy all those up front, sit them in a warehouse at, 5 to 10% cost per annum, to cover the costs of money spent ahead, cost of the warehousing, safety, all of the insurances and everything that it takes to keep something in a warehouse, right?
Yeah. I like the fact that, let me just bring in your central point previously. You're at the opposite of, you're trying to do the best for your employer and you want to think critically. You just have to spend some time giving deep thoughts about your career, the process that you're going through, and all of that. So, I mean, three of the career advices that I heard from your last episode with Ethan was really helpful for me, and I think it's worth digging more into, if you don't mind.
No, I don't mind. It's one of the things that I got asked a lot when I used to go to conferences. People would say, have you got some career advice for me?
Yes,
Anyway, over the years, I've boiled it down into 3 things.
yes,
First of all, you don't have to be smart to be successful. You just have to be persistent,
hmm
right? So one of the things about packet pushes is we were too stupid to give up.
I think you're being too humble, but yes, okay.
Any normal person, like you can remember when we started this in 2010, every Sunday we would get together and record a show. And then Ethan or I would then edit it down and then upload it onto an FTP server and then publish the blog post. It took hours and hours and hours. Any normal person would be down the pub or playing sport with their friends or, watching sports ball, watching a bunch of men or women dress up in stupid costumes and run around the paddock hugging each other and thinking that's a good time, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So you don't have to be smart. The secret to a career is to be persistent.
hmm
Just keep plugging away at it. And sometimes I've said to people, your career is a marathon, not a sprint.
hmm
And so many people in the tech industry want to win. They want to succeed and they throw themselves into it and they push and they push and they push and then they burn out or they have a crash
Right.
or they get derailed by a health problem or whatever, right? So my point is your career is a marathon. Don't rush it.
hmm
Your goal is to run the 26 miles or the 50 odd years that you're going to be working for
hmm
and just plod your way through it. And there are no prizes for running at the front of the pack anymore. In fact, if you are running at the front of the pack, it probably just means you're going to get shot out. You're going to get cut down by something, right? So, and there's a number of times in my career I followed out on a new technology
Yeah,
only for it to flame out and fail.
yeah.
And all that effort, like, let me give you an example, IPv6.
hmm
In 2004, I thought IPv6 was absolutely going to be the thing.
hmm
And I spent well over 300 hours getting deep textbooks, reading them, labbing, working on IPv6, mastering it, and never ever used it.
mm
Never.
hmm
Never in my professional career did I use any of that knowledge. So you don't want to be at the front sometimes, right?
Yeah. You want to be a quick follower. Yeah.
No, take risks if there's a job and you go, like I'm not a big fan of startups. I think the thing about startups is that 90% of them fail completely
hmm
and you will walk away with nothing. So all that effort for nothing, right?
Yeah.
And it's becoming harder and harder for startups to recruit people because they're going like, no, I want my money now. The Facebooks of this world is a lottery ticket, right?
Yes.
The Instagrams of this world is even beyond a lottery ticket winner, right? It's a once
hmm
in a lifetime type thing. So you are not going to get, that lottery ticket.
The odds are against you for finding the next Nvidia or X or Facebook or whatever. That yeah, the odds is against you. So yeah.
If you think you're going to play that game and win, you would probably be better off saying, no, I need to just have a career that paces myself out.
hmm
And if you get lucky, you get lucky. So yeah, so that's the first one. The second one is always be ready to move to the next position or job.
Yep.
So as a freelancer, the lesson I learned from moving to job was that I had more skills, more capabilities. I learned to communicate because I had to.
Yeah.
I didn't get stuck with the same group of people and we all learned to communicate in a common language and we all knew what was going on. I had to learn to fit in, right? So I could start a job and by the end of day 3, I was delivering valuable work. Because if you don't, as a freelancer, you're out,
Yeah.
right? But if you're an employee, I've seen employees sit around for a month before they start doing useful work.
I would also add to that is just always be moving right onto the next position or job, and also not to box yourself in with whatever things that you think you're in your lane of, right? Like, so for me, what helped me the most is always butt into other people's business, really, to ask them questions, to try to be outside of the box. And for you, back to our conversation earlier, not just doing your job, but you're also blogging, you're also talking to other executives, you're visiting all the other conferences that open up so much door for you. So yeah, I totally agree with the second point. Obviously, the first one was good as well, but totally agree with the second one. Be ready for the next position or job and start doing that job, right? Like, you don't need approval to be the analyst that you set out to be. I mean,
A quick sponsor break to hear about Torero. Torero is a free tool from the network automation and orchestration folks at iTential. What does Torero do? Torero builds an execution environment around your Python scripts, Ansible playbooks, or OpenTofu plans so that you can run them as a service. This means that you don't have to worry whether or not your peer will be able to run your automation. You're getting rid of the "it works on my laptop but nowhere else" problem. Because once that automation exists as a Torero service, all the dependencies have been handled. So I worked through the Torero Hello World demo, and it was straightforward. I installed Torero on an Ubuntu box. Linux and Mac are both supported, including Apple Silicon, and connected Torero to a public GitHub repo that I created for the test. In that repo was a simple Python script and a requirements.txt. I told Torero to create a service around that Python script, and Torero read the requirements file and built the service. Now, the script is executable via Torero Run. Torero can be run on a single machine your team shares in local mode or in a server mode that dispatches automation jobs to Torero clients. Build your automation, turn it into a Torero service, and share it with your team. Download free Torero at torero.dev. That's Torero.dev.
No, you don't. You can just start doing it online today. You can start a TikTok account or a YouTube account and start talking about it. You know what? The first year, 2, 3, 4, you might be hopeless at it, but at some point you'll practice your way out of it.
back to your first point about being persistent. Yeah.
Being persistent, right? And the other thing about always being ready to move on to the next job, always have a plan B, always be ready to go, always have a foot out the door,
Mm-hmm.
is if you can't be replaced, you can't be promoted. If you've got a mindset that I'm irreplaceable, well, you can always be replaced. Now, it might hurt for the company might hurt. They might have to replace one of you with 3 people, and it's going to cost them extra money.
Mm-hmm.
They might go through some disruption or some whatever, or outages.
Yeah.
But that doesn't matter. They'll just go through it. Like, they'll get through it, right? You are not irreplaceable. You might be painful to replace, but that's not irreplaceable. But keep in mind that if you can't be replaced, you can't be promoted. So if you want to get out of the campus, the campus LAN and go to campus Wi-Fi, but you're the only campus LAN guy, well, you're going to be in trouble. That's actually going to nail your foot to the floor. That's why it's usually easy to quit your job and go somewhere else, because most companies are dysfunctional. Most employers don't want you moving around anymore. Most IT managers are so overworked and so incompetent. They get no training. They get no time to reflect on their planning or to review themselves and whatever. They're just stumbling from one disaster to the next, right? What do you think's going to happen when you're in that situation? They're not looking at you and planning out your career anymore. They're just trying to survive like you are. They want to go home to their kids, or they want to impress the boss above them in the hope of getting a pay rise. And if you're reporting to them, you know what? They don't even want to know you exist. I remember turning up to one of my CIOs once, and he goes, "Who are you?" I said, "I'm the guy that runs this team." And he goes, "Why don't I know about you?" I
Mm-hmm.
say, "Because I am awesome and I never need to come and see you."
Yeah. Yeah.
And he laughed at me and gave me a pay rise straight up. He said, "Are you joking me?" I said, "No." And he turned around to the people that were in the room. They said, "Is he right?" And they went, "Yes."
I mean, that's a great story. And just to follow up on that thoughts is, I think Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger have talked about this concept of margin of safety, right? So are all these things that can knock you out with one shot, like whether that's medical, whether that's financial. And what you want to do is recognizing that core things and start building buffers around it of, margin of safety.
Yeah.
And that is what Warren Buffett has always stressed.
Well, if you've always got one foot going out the door, you'll always have safety money,
Exactly.
because if you need that money to tide you through. Now, that situation is very different in the US, where health insurance and banking is different.
Yep.
And that country doesn't really like its citizens at all, right? Because it hates you, right? It really, really does, right? You might get some freedoms, but in Europe, your healthcare might be covered and your pensions might, if there's a safety net, right? So it's a different situation. But think about what happens if you're in South America. I
Right.
remember talking to a chap from Brazil, and he was talking about what happens if he leaves the company and something goes wrong. Then he is absolutely in a world of hurt. And in Asian countries, there's also, it's a lot less now than it was, but there used to be a lot of face and honor, in the Asian countries, and it was very difficult to leave and to move on. So you have to be culturally aware of your situation, but take the advice and then the last thing that I wanted to talk about in Korea is focus on the important things, which
Hmm.
is different for different people. So work to live, don't live to work. And it's a mistake I made to some extent, right?
Right.
The reason that you're working is to get money to do something else.
Yep.
Now, if you decide in your career marathon that you're going to allocate 3 years to getting this certification or picking up this skill, that is absolutely a trade-off that you should take if you are aware of the price that you are going to pay.
That's right.
But focus on family, focus on friends, sports ball, gaming, whatever it is that's your passion, make sure you hold on to that passion and say, I am not living to work, because the company will always take as much as you will give it.
Yeah.
And your job is to give it as little as possible for the pay that you get for it.
Yeah.
Right? The company owes you nothing and you owe the company nothing.
Yeah.
Right?
To follow up on that thought of focus on the important things, I do have this book recommendation called Your Life or Your Money. And, I recommend the revised edition, which is like, even the revised edition, it was came out in like 2008 or something. But the first edition was a lot earlier than that. And to me, it's a classic where they propose the idea of the keyword that you mentioned, Greg, of enough. Like, what is enough? And beyond enough,
Yeah.
everything is just, extra and safety, margin of safety that give you a little bit more in for error.
You don't need a new car. Get a second-hand car. So my idea of rich is to spend less than I earn.
Hmm.
Right? That is literally rich.
Right. Right.
And the more I earn, the more I can spend. I'm never spending more than I have, except for a house mortgage. But even then, the metaphor still applies, right?
Right.
So the goal should be is, if I'm earning this, that means I buy a secondhand car. And one day maybe you'll get to buy a new car and you can be very proud of it. But don't jump the gun and buy a new car at 21 when you can't afford it.
Yeah, on loan, on credit, or whatever. So it ties
Yeah.
back into your second point about if you're always be ready to the next position or job, then you have to be conscious of, your current
Yeah.
spending, your current earning. And if that earning comes from passive income, something that, invest long enough, then you're actually set. And that's another thing that,
Yeah.
you talked about in your other episode of like financial independence, maybe even retire early, the FIRE movement and all of that. So I think all of these 3 points that you brought up is really good. Yeah.
They all interlock. They're not standalone. They all interlock, right? If you're
Right.
always ready to move on, you've got to have savings. You've got to have the stuff you money.
Right.
If the boss is really driving you mad or somebody at work you don't like, you need to be able to say, stuff you, I'm out. Right? There's nothing so freeing as being able to say, stuff this, I'm not happy, it's causing me stress. But if you're trapped, and this is the thing about America in particular, is your healthcare is linked to your employer.
Right.
So you can't walk out. You are trapped where you are. They've got you in a trap around healthcare, which is, if you're going to move, it just means the barrier is a bit higher, but it doesn't mean it's impossible to move all the time, right? And especially when you're young, you can easily move because healthcare is less likely to be a concern. But when you're married and, you've got a partner and you've got babies and they need access to healthcare, it's really difficult to move, in America. Whereas in Europe or whatever, you can move all the time. It's much less dangerous or much less likely to be an irresponsible act.
Yeah, the margin of safety is a little bit different, like you said, and then your margin of error is a little greater that you're able to make taking more risk in your career, being entrepreneur or whatnot in different environments. But you're right. I think the situation is still changing a little bit, especially after some of the reforms over the last couple of years. And but we won't get into the politics.
Yeah. And here's a key, right? The thing about worker mobility was that was a key plank of capitalism.
Hmm.
When it was originally invented back in the 16th century.
Right.
What the key realization was that if workers could move around, then they would move from low value jobs, low profit, low value, to higher paid, higher profit jobs.
Hmm.
So in the 16th centuries, when the first industrial wave came along, the Industrial Revolution started in the United Kingdom or in Great Britain, what they did was they moved workers off the land, low value subsistence lifestyles, into the factories, and the workers got richer, but the whole economy got richer, and then the lifestyle. So keep in mind that the ability for workers to move from job to job is actually a part of capitalism. It is a socialist thing to trap workers into a job, in the absolute definition of the form of communism, by the way. So if you are one of these people who like capitalism equals freedom, and which is a very narrow view of things, but you need to understand that capitalism was about mobility and freedoms, and it was the freedom to change employers and the freedoms to change, and that moving from low value, low profit jobs to higher value, high profit jobs created the modern world that we live in today.
On the same line of capitalism and retirement, because I've actually been thinking about it a lot, triggered by your announcement. And
Mm,
obviously we lost Nick Russo
yeah.
and, and all of the other events triggered me to think about it a little bit on retirement and all of that. And what surprised me when I dig more into it is the retirement structure that we know as of today is actually pretty new. I think this was generation wise, especially for things like 401k or IRA. IRA was actually created after I was born. And 401k, I'm
Yeah.
speaking in strictly US terms. How many generations of, say, your parents or your grandparents have actually gotten like pension or these retirement structure that we take for granted? So you really have to follow all three of your career advices.
So 100 years ago, they relied on their children,
Yeah, exactly. The family structure, the Asian way, really.
and the Asians were much later in the cycle, but the US and Europe were much earlier in that cycle. The pensions came about in the post-war era
Yes.
as a part of the social change that the First and Second World Wars had engendered into those countries. But the billionaires, the rich people, have done their best to chip away at that. So that they've been capturing, in my view, they've been capturing the revenue of the middle class to enrich themselves. And what we need is to go back to what happened in the 1920s to 1950s, which was the people who are rich didn't earn it, they stole it from the working class. That is a gross simplification, and we are way out of context. But as a gross generalization,
Yeah.
the wealthy people of the era, in the crash of Wall Street in 1929, was a redistribution of wealth from the rich to the poor. And what we're now realizing is, and this is me getting way off track, but one of the things that we're realizing right now is, as with the wealthy companies or the wealth class has been raising the prices of everything to see what the market will bear. And what they've suddenly discovered is people aren't buying their products. What the lesson that we're seeing now, like, for example, Starbucks and McDonald's in the US and indeed worldwide have raised the prices of their items. And now they found out that sales are dropping away quite precipitously. It took a while, took
Yep.
nearly a year and a half.
The $30 Happy Meal. Yeah.
That's right. And now the price is coming back down as they try and get control, but the customers have moved on. Right? They're not coming back. And so there's a very interesting social outcome of that. Think about how dominant certain brands have been and their ability to capture the market. But now they've broken the trust they had with their customers. And I think there's some interesting lessons there to be learned in IT, right? You can take that lesson, that business lesson from there. If you're going to continue to overcharge me and treat me badly, then I might just find a different way to do this.
Right. I mean, and we've seen that, right? Like if you're just all about maximizing shareholder value and you're trying to squeeze as much juice out of that lemon, at some point that lemon's going to yell out and say, I don't think this is working out for me. So,
Broadcom and VMware.
yeah.
As a rough rule, most customers are facing a 300 to 700% price increase. They're
Yes.
getting things, they're getting other values, certain products are added into the bundle and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
But they don't want them sometimes, right? They don't want NSX security. They've been doing it a different way. And now that they've got it, the only way that they can make an ROI out of it is by jumping in. Okay, well, Broadcom is basically saying you're either all in or you're all out. And a lot of customers are trapped because they don't have the resources to migrate away.
You're saying for now, right? They're trapped for now.
Yep.
So, for example, I, just moving away from networking, but still stay within the technology space. I mean, for me, I've been paying for Adobe Cloud for years and years and years for subscription.
Yeah.
And that's only because they don't even sell the bundle shrink rack software anymore. So I think what in reference back to your VMware example or a lot of the subscription licensing model is that, yeah, the customers are trapped for now, but at some point, they're going to revolt and perhaps find an alternative.
My concern with the Broadcom VMware is that Broadcom is raising the price on the sales pitch that you are now getting all of our portfolio. So VVF and VCF, right? They're giving you the whole, the 5-course meal instead of the 2 courses. They've given you if you don't want all 5 courses because you don't want to gain weight, You don't want to pay for a 5-course meal. You want to pay for a 2-course meal. And the question here now from the vendors that I'm speaking to and the briefings that I'm getting is I think every company is reevaluating a relationship with VMware.
Mhm.
Now, for sure, most of them won't move because it's just going to be a very difficult thing, right? But they'll be doing the numbers and saying, if VMware is this, how much is it going to cost me to move to an alternate solution?
Right.
And the gamble here from Broadcom is to say, well, if we give you all of these things and lock you into a 3-year contract, at the end of the 3 years, you might just be using all those things and we got you.
Yeah,
Does that
the
make sense?
inertia, yeah, the momentum and the inertia of just keeping things the way they are.
And if it was me, if I'm working at a company, I'd be like, I don't care. It's not my money. That's the CIO's job, right? Is to make the decisions, not mine.
Yeah,
I just want to work on VMware because the next company I want to go and work for is going to have VMware. I'm okay with that. As long as you understand, do you know what I mean? That's what Broadcom's playing the game with, right? And
yeah,
this is why understanding business strategy is important. If you get in with VMware, a lot of people bet their professional lives on saying, I'm going to be I'm going to be a VMware certificate thing. They don't think of themselves as a applications, or an infrastructure engineer. They think of themselves as a VMware, a brand thing. Right?
right.
I'm a Starbucks coffee drinker. I only drink Starbucks. Like cars is the classic one. My dad buys Lada cars, so I have to own a Lada car, right? Or Ford man, or whatever that era from the 60s and 70s is. It doesn't make sense anymore. I think people need to stop associating with a brand and say, just because I play for this football team doesn't mean I don't play for that football team.
Right.
And the skills are transferable, right?
Right.
I am a server infrastructure engineer, whether I'm doing it with VMware or Nutanix or Proxmox or KVM or whoever, whatever it is that you're going to use, all of those skills are transferable.
Yeah.
And the only thing that you have by being brand certified or brand aligned is that you know the bugs of that product.
Yeah.
You remember what I said at the top about bugs and gotchas?
I like how you're circling back into what you were talking about in the beginning. Yeah, I've heard of people who talked about this is a Cisco shop, this is a Juniper shop. But yeah, for now, but think about your next job. If you don't have any transferable skill sets, if you don't always have your, ready to move on to the next thing. Yeah.
If you're a Juniper or a VMware, you've got a core structure set, routing, protocols, APIs,
Exactly.
Telemetry, troubleshooting, and that is all just transferable to another one. And the only reason it's all transferable, except in your mind, and that's a perception created by the marketing people
Hmm.
so that you don't leave. So that is in your mind.
Yeah.
That is not a real, I agree with what you're saying, but we are indoctrinated to think, oh, I am brand certified in this product. Therefore, I will only work at companies who have this brand product. And the CIOs and the senior engineers are also inculcated in that.
Hmm.
But if you stand in front of them and go, I just worked on this product and it's all the same. Like this product, that product, they're all the same. And as soon as you say that to them, they go, oh, yeah. You can say, I'm brand certified A, but all of those skills are just the same in brand B. I'll learn it in a week or two.
Yeah.
If you think I'm the right person, and most often that's all you need to say. And they go like, that's a good attitude.
Yeah, that's a great mindset. It's a growth mindset, and you're always, do mindful practices, right? Like you're always expanding on your skill set on just one step further and all that. Well, I have to be honest to the listener here. So we're actually approaching the hour mark that we are, but we're only covering like a fraction of the stuff that Greg and I have prepared for you, like network automation, should you write code? So maybe we just, I don't know, we pick one thing that you really want to talk about as the next question, and we'll just wrap up on the session, Greg.
Okay, so the thing I want to talk about is network automation, right? Everybody's gotten bent out of shape about network automation, and it has to be Python scripting with Ansible. And I think that is wrong,
Okay.
right? I want to point out that OSPF and BGP are automation,
Tell us more.
algorithmic automation, right?
Yeah.
Because in the old days, we used to put, OSPF on a network and it would go around and reconfigure the network according to whatever happened to the network, right?
Right, right.
That's automation, right?
That is automation. Yeah. Your neighbor negotiation, your establishment. Yeah.
Yeah. And the devices would self-configure themselves. And I think people have sort of forgotten this, right? And I think one of the mistakes that we make today is that BGP is the fossil fuel of networking, and it's toxic and it's dirty and it's messy and it kind of works. But I think at some point we're going to have to walk away from BGP, and networking is sort of converged on this BGP. And it's gotten to the point now where BGP isn't actually a routing protocol anymore. It's just a message bus. I
Mhm.
can use an API to put stuff into BGP, and the rest of the network will follow the configuration, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Is BGP a good message bus? No, it's awful. Right? It's the worst message bus.
Yeah.
You could go out and pick like there's lots of open source message buses that if you put a message on with a bunch of configuration or signals to do telemetry or whatever, and the whole network could run this message bus, that would be way better than BGP.
Like a Kafka inside of your routing protocol. As somebody who worked down the pan with my friend Rich and passively glean messages that BGP carried, I totally agree with you. The
Yeah.
BGP has become like the Frankenstein of our world, where it's a message bus. Yeah, it's fossil fuel.
Nobody wants to get off the fossil fuels, right?
Yeah.
Everybody thinks they want an electric vehicle because they're getting it, but what they're actually doing is using fossil fuel. And it's messy and it's toxic and it's going to be really messy to clean up, but nobody wants to change it at this point in time. But I want people to think about the fact is that we've always done network automation. Back in the late 90s, I was writing Perl scripts into SNMP to do network configuration.
Hmm.
Well, Perl and Tickle and, punching some things on the CLI and some
Yeah.
things on the SNMP until Cisco decided that it really didn't like supporting SNMP code because it bought its SNMP from another company.
Mm.
And it didn't want to pay for the licenses and it didn't want to have to do the necessary changes to make it highly performant.
Hmm.
And so Cisco killed SNMP. They just said, we're not supporting it anymore.
Oh, wow.
And that's basically because before then, Bay Networks and before them, a bunch of other vendors, they were all in, and Cabletron were all in on SNMP as an API for configuration. But Cisco didn't want to because they didn't want to invest in their products. They wanted to keep it all around the CLI, which would be cheap for them. And in that era, everybody bought their SNMP library from third parties, by the way. It's not obvious in network operating systems that that's actually, most of them bought their SSH code from a third party. Like the
Hmm.
whole management plane was bought off the shelf from a company in the back. IP Fusion today, do you know IP Fusion?
No.
Okay. 20 years ago, IP Fusion was a company that used to make all of these modules for devices, and the vendors would go and buy them.
Hmm.
SSH, SNMP, XML, blah, blah, blah. And then they would just go and the vendors didn't write all of this code.
Yeah, I think I heard about it from Russ White's courses on how networking really works. They talk about like these are componentized and modules that people actually bought and stitched together.
Yeah. And that's why Linux took off in networking, was because they didn't need to go do that anymore
Hmm.
because SNMP was in Linux for free
Yeah.
and the multi-threaded operating system and all that sort of stuff. And that's why ultimately Linux got in, is because it actually saved them money. They didn't get into Linux to be open or any of that sort of stuff. They actually got into it so that they could stop paying supply
Licensing fees.
their license. And they had to pay the licenses for as many as they sold.
Yeah.
And Cisco's problem was that, as I was told, was that the CLI engine was badly written and the SNMP used to punch into the CLI. And so the SNMP performance was always going to be bad. And it would actually cause devices to crash. And Cisco didn't want to fix it. And so they sort of worked in the IETF and the other groups to make SNMP miserable and for it to eventually fail.
I'd be like, oh, streaming telemetry it is then.
Yeah. Well, it used to work fine on Bay Networks gear and what later became Nortel, because they had this really amazing engine that was able to do hundreds and hundreds of SNMP puts and gets and sets per second, whereas Cisco could do 3,
Mhm.
that sort of thing. But it wasn't something that a lot of people did at the time. And so it never really, Cisco got ahead of it and was able to push the market in a certain direction. Good for them, I suppose, right?
Yeah.
So the question is, if we've been doing networking automation, should we be writing code? So here's my view on this, very controversial view. No, networking is not about writing code. And for me, what you should be doing is networking, right? It's very helpful to be able to say, I want to be able to write code and understand how code's used. So if you're going to be in the software-defined era and you're going to have apps that are doing configuration on your network, you should do some coding to understand modules and APIs and how the code goes together. But the idea that you're going to, artisanally handcraft a piece of Python, like, getting a stick and crafting it artisanally with a, that's dumb. You should outsource that to somebody else. You should go to a vendor who specializes in making walking sticks, right? And you should not get a piece of stick from the wood and then spend days and days and days carving it into a walking stick and then finding out you got it wrong and going and getting another piece of wood and then doing it 10 times until you finally got a decent walking stick, right? You should just go and buy a walking stick.
Yeah.
So I think this movement to continue to push on Python and Ansible and all of the tooling around that died 5 years ago. That game was done. But nobody's looking up from the keyboard to realize that the world changed around them, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
You should be out there talking to a company that's got an automation platform, Itential, Glueware. There's dozens of them, but they're the two that are in my mind because they sponsor packet pushers all the time, right?
Hmm.
And they do all that work. They write the device interfaces. They have a source of truth. They have a configuration tracking engine. Why would you build that yourself? Why are you writing Python scripts to stalk, into Netbox or one of those tool sets to have a source of truth? Why are you writing to a DHCP API to push it? Like, someone's already done that. Why aren't you buying that? Tell me why.
Well, I think the point that you brought out was to understand the concept, to have the mindset, to know how everything works.
Mm,
Then to me, I hear everything you're saying, but to me is you have the option, you have the choice
mm,
to either go right into that code to really focus on the right beautiful code, or you could
mm.
stay within your CLI, your networking
Yeah.
and design the architect, because there's no way you could, I think, automate an architect because the things that they do are so not repeatable. So I think in my perspective was to have that option.
I mean, the question is, are you really adding value? If you're configuring, writing some Python and some Ansible code to create VLANs and put an IP address on it, that's
Hmm.
not valuable work. Right?
Hmm.
What is valuable work? Well, valuable work would be deploying a digital experience monitoring solution to detect brownouts in the network.
Hmm.
And not just blackouts, not just absolute failures, but is there a brownout, a partial failure? If the network fails over, what is the user experience? Not the packet loss. Nobody cares about packet loss. Well, you do. You do care about packet loss after the user has had a problem, right?
Right. In terms of delivery. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So you should be out there running a digital experience monitoring platform. That's where your energy should be. So I've come up with this sort of rough guide here that there's an 80-20 rule. We talk a lot about 80-20 rules in life.
Hmm.
Everything's 80-20, right?
Yep.
20% of the people do 80% of the work, right? So here's how it works. Every company uses the same equipment, the same protocols. You use the same designs and the same processes to operate the network. Everybody's using the same CLIs, the same Python, the same Ansible, the same libraries, right? You are not a special, precious, unique unicorn of a network. Your network is identical to everybody else's. And you know why? Because you can leave that network and take your skills and go off to the next one. If you were unique, every network, you wouldn't be able to take your skills and be transferable to somewhere else, right? So
Right.
you are not unique, right? It's like driving a car. Everybody can drive a car. Once you've got a license, you can drive any car. Trucks are a little bit different. There's a shift there, blah, blah, blah. Motorcycles, a bit different, but one license fits all cars. When you operate a network, all those skills are transferable to any network, like I said before, right? Just because you work on a brand vendor and you know that which bugs which go where, or their approach to, implementing a particular well-known protocol, but you are not unique. You're not a special bunny who's got something unique. So 80% of your infrastructure is common, well-known, well understood. You can talk to anybody about it and they'll all go, yeah, 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 Ethernet this and IP this and route this and, blah, 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 right? If you're writing code, you need to be focused on writing just the 20% of uniqueness.
Okay.
So what is it about this business that is unique to this particular company's way of working? Now, most of that will be legacy. They've got this DHCP server, or they've got some process which was implemented 20 years ago, and that's what makes it unique. That doesn't make it right or best. It just means that's the situation. So you need to write some glue, right? Maybe you've got some sort of a DDI system over here that you inherited, and it's a requirement for federal law. There's a lot of this going on where there's, Infoblocks, for example, is quite often federally mandated,
Hmm.
but it's useless. But what you actually want is to, write a thing between that to something else to make it useful to you. Well, that's okay. Write that, but don't write the DHCP server.
Yeah. So don't write the 80% that was common for everybody else, but focus on the 20%. I mean, I just heard just recently on heavy networking where they interview a gentleman from the heavy trading company, where that 20% for them is actually in the monitoring, right? Like everything else, they don't need to,
Yes.
they buy routers and switches from off the shelf, they're multi-vendor, yada, yada, yada. However, the 20% for them is they offer the most unique value in do high frequency trading monitoring. They
Yeah.
write monitoring for the monitoring. So I think that fits into that concept that you just introduced on, yeah, write code, but write it for that 20% of the uniqueness that offers the most value.
And you shouldn't be writing code for everything. You should just be sitting somewhere, like if you've got a bunch of tools out there, you've probably got 4 or 5 tools together. Maybe you have to glue them together,
Or
right?
20. Yeah.
Whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
don't write the tool from the ground up, because that's just going to drive you insane. Because every time a new operating system comes around or there's a CLI change, you want to pay somebody to do that. You want to outsource that, right?
Yeah.
So you want a tool that you bought from a vendor who's got a team of developers in India who are tracking all the latest code releases
Yeah.
and doing all that for you. What you want to be able to do is hit an API and say, configure me an MPLS verf from between this point and this point, blah, 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 with these parameters, and boom, off it goes. You don't want to actually be writing the playbook to actually put the CLI into this version of code on this hardware platform on this slot and specifying interface, all that.
But you do have to learn enough to know what an API is. You have to know enough
Yeah.
networking to know what a verb is, what is needed, and being in clear enough mindset to know what is the most important value offer for your company. So, hey, Greg, I know we're moving along all these topics. So, what the heck? This is one of your last recordings that you ever do. Let's take 5 hours and cover all of them. Yeah.
So the big thing about automation and why automation has to become orchestration. So I think automation is a solved problem. It's done. Your automation is going to be done by a vendor. You're going to buy a tool chain from somewhere and you're going to get that. What you need to think about is orchestrating multiple things. And the reason for that is because the network is moving further out to the edge. So you think about when SD-WAN came along and
Mhm.
put overlays in the network. You didn't make the network less complicated. It made it more complicated because now you've got the physical underlay and you've got an
Yeah.
overlay and you don't actually know where the packets are going, right? And
Right.
then SD-WAN turned into SASE, added a bunch of cybersecurity functions in there. So now all of a sudden your packets are wandering off to Cloudflare or some sort of scanning service. What does the performance look like in that situation? Where's the outage in that loop? Is it in the underlay? Is it in the overlay? Is it in the SD-WAN appliance? Is it in the SSE code inspection? Is it in the off-prem cloud functionality? Is it in the destination? Like, is Azure down? Is Microsoft Office down? Like, how do you troubleshoot that? That's your value add, right? That is your value add going forward. Now, I want to give you an example in the data center why orchestration is so important. In the data center today, the NIC is going to be part of the network, right? It has to be, because if you've got a server that's got 400 containers or 50 VMs in it, the
Right.
network has to move inside of the server, right?
Right.
So if you think about it, if you add a NIC to the network,
That's just exponential. Yeah.
right? So let's say you've got 200 servers in a data center. So that means 400 physical ports. So let's say that's 10 switches, 10 leafs. You'll have a couple of spines and 10 leafs, right? But now all of a sudden, you're going to go from 400 ports to 410 devices to manage. So
Mhm.
400 NICs plus the 10 switches. And
Right.
you're actually going to have your VXLANs terminating in the NIC, as well as all the security policy on top of that.
Yeah.
You are not going to do that with automation. You need orchestration, something that unifies the whole thing together, right?
Yeah.
So automation is, in my mind, is always designed that one thing. You automate one task. I need to automate data entry into this spreadsheet. So you make a spreadsheet, you automate the data entry. You didn't orchestrate extracting the data from here, formatting it, cleaning it up, putting it into Excel, then extracting that into a report. Orchestrating is saying, I've got a dozen automation tasks underneath here, and I have to do them all in a flow, a workflow.
Yeah.
But it might branch somewhere, right?
Yeah. So I think what you're saying is orchestration is about decisions and automation is about just the underlying driver that you use to get that task done. But the value add should be in your orchestration, your decision making.
But if you're a data center nerd and you're suddenly gone from managing 10 switches and the front end and the east out, where you go out to the campus networks, whatever. And now all of a sudden your data center's gone from 10 devices to 410
Yeah.
devices.
Yeah.
That just changes the game, right? And the same is happening in the campus edge, remote, I call it distributed work.
Yep.
Work happens everywhere. Home, office, customer site, on a plane, as well as in a campus, right? Those days of, even in hospitals, people are just as likely to be using a laptop on a cart inside of a patient's room or in a radiography room. They're not attached to the campus in the traditional format anymore, right?
Yeah.
So, this idea that you have to artisanally manage everything with this handcrafted massive attention to detail, we're done. That's over. What you've got to be able to say is, I've got 410 devices in this network, and I don't care. I've got something over the top of them to configure them, and I don't have to worry about it. What I really need to know is, how is that working? Are we delivering the service? And that's where your value is. That's what'll get you a pay rise. Your ability to configure an interface or a BGP protocol isn't
Yeah.
going to get you a pay rise.
Yeah, I agree. Multiple levels. We even see like a fan on the GBIC, right? So like, yeah, for sure. Like your data controlling unit on your NIC is actually your DPU is actually an aggregation of tens of networks for your tenants, and on top of that abstraction.
What VMware can do on a Bluefield 3 DPU, not only is it going to abstract the storage engine away, it'll also completely abstract the network away, right?
Hmm.
So what you
Yep.
will see, is a natively attached NIC in every Tanzu instance, but attached to that will be a cybersecurity. So there'll be an IDS and a firewall, a WAF, a load balancer, and that will all be running on the DPU. So now think about that, right? So now your NIC isn't just a physical connection. You've now got 400 servers, and now you've got 200 servers with 400 ports. Well, now you've got 200 load balancers and 200 WAFs and 200 IDSs. And the only way you can configure those, and this is what VMware got right, is to say there has to be a central console and a policy, and we'll work out where the policy goes. You don't have to know.
Right. Right.
And that's where networking is heading.
That is amazing to think about on just a scale, even within a moderate sized data center. If we get to that point that you're talking about, as far as the policy, the segregation, the separation of concerns, all of these stuff are just at a massive scale. So, I mean, Greg, I know you also want to talk about open source because that is something near and dear.
No, it's not really important. The only thing I wanted to mention about that is that open source is pretty much dying, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Everything has its day in the sun, and the open source movement was amazing, is amazing, even now, right? But the modern corporate ethos is all of the money is mine.
Hmm.
The days of a corporation giving back, right? So let's talk about AWS. How much money do you think AWS gives to open source projects?
Oh my God. Like as a former employee, I know one of the most complaint about AWS internally, externally is how little they give back.
That's right. Okay. Azure, same. Little bit
Yeah,
better.
Azure a little
Google,
bit more,
a little bit
but
better.
yeah,
Intel does a lot, but that's all very self-motivated. I'm just saying, like AWS, the company that has literally built a multi-hundreds of billions of dollars business in AWS on the back of open source software that it took from somebody else.
right.
It invests in software for itself, but it doesn't give back. And that's probably the poster child for the movement, right? If you're using open source inside of your enterprise, are you giving back? Now, part of the problem here is that open source got so complicated, and so, everything's getting more complex. And the days of, I wrote a pretty simple script that, a few hundred lines of code, and now you have apps that have, millions of lines of code. There is a shift here, right?
Yeah.
I think that ultimately open source, the movement is going to strangle for the foreseeable future unless we can find a way. Open source started as a way for us to share my scripts, my nasty little Python script or something like that, right? And then it scaled up a little bit and somebody put a bit more effort in, and then somebody wrote a Perl piece with a bit of C in here to do and so on and so forth. But I think ultimately open source has possibly had its best days are behind it, and it's fading away. I am sad about this, but the thing is that the companies are greedy. They don't want to give back. They're saying, you gave it to me for free. I'm taking it for free.
Hmm.
You can say to me that I've got a responsibility to give back to you. You could also say to me that you have a responsibility to treat your employees well. We don't do that either, right?
I think open source sustainability or open source as it was before is I mean, they clearly have won. So now we're actually moving to the second phase. It's almost like baseball, different innings, or
Yeah.
in soccer forms and American football, whatever. But open source as it was is not sustainable. So we got to move on to the whatever.
The interesting part here is that last time I looked into this, Intel was spending close to $1 billion a year in supporting resources for Linux
Hmm.
and keeping it running on the x86 and running optimally on the Intel.
Hmm.
AMD commits a certain amount, similar sort of funds.
Yeah.
All of that AMD CPU code primarily comes from AMD.
Hmm.
ARM is doing something similar to get its code running on the thing. Right now, Intel's in deep financial trouble. Right, it's probably not going to be the same company in 10 years. Intel will not be the dominant player. It will be a much different market going forward. So if Intel stops spending $1 billion a year on developers and contributing code and writing new drivers for new features that it's providing, if it just says like, we can't do that, we need to give that money to shareholders, what happens to Linux?
Yeah.
Because AWS isn't going to step up.
No. In fact, they have their own version of Linux and it's closed source and proprietary and yeah, and it only runs well on Amazon hardwares. Yeah.
Yes. There's just too many weaknesses in the open source movement. It was something that I think increasingly was a thing. So if you're planning a career in open source, just make sure you go into it with open eyes. You could have a very good run, but I think its time in the sun has passed. And the complexities of sustaining open source projects in the future are not my problem. They're your problem because I'm retiring tomorrow. But you might want to go into it with open eyes and think carefully about how long that lasts and how frustrating it would be to see that tear down.
Right. I think for me, I'm a little bit more optimistic. I do think the days of, remember the 2010 era where a lot of
Mhm.
company that was enterprise back open source like Elastic, Kafka, and in our networking space, like maybe a little
Mhm.
bit the Netbox and Autobots, all of these are company backed open source projects or, Ansible to Red Hat, all of that. That era has shifted and you don't see a lot
Mhm.
of company in the 2020 era that does that anymore. So we do need to rethink about the open source model.
Yeah.
Maybe the Python Software Foundation have found a way where, they aggregate all these smaller projects and they go ahead and have this umbrella and go solicit a donation of the $1 million to $2 million that they could do and then distribute it to the different open source project. I've seen that work well with, like the Flask project or some other projects. Maybe we do
Yeah.
something like Anaconda where they're really into open source, but they also have on equal footing on their commercial product and open source product as opposed to it being
Mm.
just solely corporate sponsored.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
My point is that, if you think you can do everything with open source, you might want to double think.
Yeah.
And it's a very common thing in IT to say, I'm not paying for that.
Yeah. Developers are very cheap.
You might want to start getting used to the days of going back to paying for Apache.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Remember when web servers cost money? I can remember when Python, if you wanted to write code in Python, you had to go and buy a Python interpreter
Yeah.
or a Pascal interpreter from Borland or
Yeah.
C++, right? I expect over time we're going to see that return gradually because, the contributions that made those possible, the people who are universities that had time. Like if you were a professor at university and you were contributing to the C compiler as a research project or for fun, that's getting less and less as the universities get more and more commercialized. I think open source isn't what you see today isn't what it's going to be in the future, and it's not going to be that way for much longer.
That we could both agree on. I mean, you don't even have to
Mm.
go very far. It was just the thing about Nginx and F5 that only happened a few weeks ago or a few months
Mm.
ago on how thing in the geopolitical influence. Yeah, Open Tofu, Terraform.
Open Tofu and Terraform, those sorts of things. And that's because the big companies like, AWS have just gazumped those products. And they did it before with MongoDB and a bunch of others.
Yep, Elastic.
Yeah, why would you? Right? If you're an open source project and somebody just takes your work and turns it into $1 billion business, you'd be a bit sore, wouldn't you?
Yeah, especially this person who pretend to be your friend to begin with and give you all kinds of credits and resources until you grow and then they grow the pig so then they could
Yeah,
slaughter it, right?
yeah, that's right. As they call it in crypto, pig slaughtering.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, when you find somebody who's got a big bunch of crypto and then you steal it from them, it's called pig butchering.
Pig butchering.
It's the same thing. That's what AWS and the cloud companies have been doing for a long period of time. They exploit it. It's a tragedy of the commons. Open source is a common resource that we shared. You know about tragedy of the commons?
Yeah.
So in the 15th and 16th century, the English common in England, they
Mhm,
had common land. Every village had a common, and every person in the village had the right to graze their cattle on the common.
mhm,
And the more people who grazed on the common, the less valuable the common land became.
mhm.
Because once it was overgrazed, it was gone.
Yeah.
So the tragedy of the commons is that if you create this resource, this freedom, is that people can come along and overexploit it, and eventually it becomes worthless. The tragedy of the commons. And to
Mm,
that sense, I think open source is going to be a tragedy of the commons. It's going to be strip mined by the big companies in the dumbest way possible. They're not even doing it deliberately. It's just like, I'm a middle level executive. Here's a product. Oh, wow, I can make money. So I go and make money. It's
mhm.
not even deliberate evil. It's just casual evil and destruction.
Just human nature that stumping on other people's goodwill. Yeah, great. I mean, we do have to wrap it up, and I'm seeing like, okay, we finally cover all the topics briefly that we could cover. Usually, I ask people, where can the people find you on social? Where can people follow you? And I think I know the answer to that.
I am going dark. This week I've deleted Twitter off all of my iDevices.
Oh wow.
And the last thread is my laptop. And
Hmm.
I will be closing out all of my social media, my LinkedIn's and all that sort of stuff. Going dark for 6 months at least
Yeah.
to rest and recuperate and find out what I'm like after 6 months. And then we'll find out. I expect that I am gone for good.
Hmm.
But never say never. Always have a plan B. Remember, if you can't be replaced, you can't be promoted. Always be ready to move on to the next position of the job. It may be that I come back. I doubt it,
Hmm.
but let's not say never. Just say that, for now. And if you've been listening to me over the years, thank you so much. If you're one of the people who left some feedback on LinkedIn or on Twitter, I mean, honestly, I was just overwhelmed. If I've not written back to you, I do apologize. It is just so overwhelming. What people have been so gracious and so generous. It's just been very difficult to respond to it all. it makes you all emotional and sort of thing. So if I've touched you or helped you, thank you for listening and being with us on the Packet Pushers. And the Packet Pushers continues, right? So Ethan and the team and you on this channel, Packet Pushers is unchanged. It's just I'm not around, and it'll probably go on and be better without me, I think.
No. Well, like I said, this is a celebration of your work. And I would want to say thank you on behalf of the community, Greg, on everything you've done. I know, never to say never. However, if this was one of your last recordings and last, shows, then I want to wish you the best of luck. And I am one of those people who reached out and I meant every single word that I said. So thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Network Automation Nerds. Do you have any feedback for Network Automation, our guest, or this episode? Send us some follow-ups on packetpushers.net/FU, FU as in follow-up. And from what I heard, that term came from Greg. So thank you for that piece of insights. And we do want to hear back from you. So check out our websites at packetpushers.net to find other network engineering focused podcasts, blogs, YouTube videos, and much more. And I also want to let you know that Network Automation Nerds will not be in the Packet Pushers Fat Pipe streaming starting in July 2024. Crying face emoji. No, it's not a hiccup in the matrix. And I promise it's not because we had too much Python. It has to do with the more precise download tracking, episode sponsorship. So please do smash that subscribe button on your favorite podcatcher to ensure future deliveries and let your friends know that this is happening so they could continue to get the deliveries of Network Automation Nerds podcasts. Last but not least, remember that too much network automation will never be enough.